Betrayal is a bitter poison, but revenge is a feast best served beneath a full moon. 5 years ago, a terrified young woman was stripped of her dignity, branded a traitor, and cast into the freezing wilderness by the very man destined to love her. They expected her to die in the snow. They were wrong. She didn't just survive the perilous winter, she conquered it. Now she has returned, not as a broken outcast, but as the ruthless Wolf Queen. The great hall of Hastings Manor was a symphony of roaring hearths, clashing goblets, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of roasted venison. It was the winter solstice of 1342, the night Lord Edward Hastings was expected to choose his Luna. As the alpha of the formidable Iron Fang territory, Edward's choice was not merely a matter of the heart, it was a ruthless political calculation. The pack's borders were strained, the harvests had been meager, and an alliance with the wealthy Croft family was the only logical salvation. Lady Rosalind Croft stood beside him, her crimson velvet gown trailing over the rush-strewn floor, her smile a practiced curve of aristocratic arrogance. But destiny has a cruel sense of humor. In the shadows of the arched stone doorways stood Beatrice Waverley. She was a scullery maid, an orphaned Omega, whose bloodline had long been swallowed by poverty and the harsh feudal system of the werewolf nobility. Her coarse, ash-colored tunic was stained with soot, her hands calloused from years of scrubbing the manor's floors. She had crept up to the hall only to collect the discarded platters, keeping her eyes averted as pack law demanded of the lowest rank. Then the wind changed. A sudden draft swept through the heavy oak doors, carrying a scent that stopped Edward's heart, dead in his chest. It was a fragrance of wild jasmine and petrichor, cutting through the overwhelming musk of perfumes and roasted meat like a silver blade. Edward's golden eyes snapped toward the doorway. His inner wolf, usually a disciplined beast of war, slammed against his ribs, howling a single, undeniable word: mate. The room fell into a deathly silence as Edward descended from the high table. Rosalind's smile faltered, her sharp eyes tracking his movement. Edward walked as if in a trance, passing the wealthiest lords and fiercest warriors of his pack, until he stopped before the trembling servant girl. Beatrice dropped her stack of wooden plates. They clattered loudly against the stone, but neither she nor Edward flinched. When he reached out and brushed a soot-stained lock of hair from her cheek, a visible spark snapped between their skin. "You," Edward whispered, his voice rough with a primal hunger that sent shockwaves through the hall. "It's you." Beatrice looked up, terrified, but utterly captivated by the alpha, whose soul suddenly felt inextricably linked to hers. For 3 agonizingly beautiful seconds, she allowed herself to believe in a miracle. She believed the moon goddess had finally shown her mercy. Then the trap snapped shut. "Guards! Seize her!" Rosalind's voice shattered the spell, sharp and shrill as broken glass. Edward blinked, the romantic haze breaking as 2 burly enforcers grabbed Beatrice by the arms, dragging her away from him. "What is the meaning of this?" Edward roared, his fangs lengthening in defensive fury. Rosalind stepped forward, feigning a look of absolute betrayal and devastation. "My lord," she cried, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Beatrice. "This wretched creature is not just a maid, she is a thief. The sacred moonstone chalice, the relic my family brought as a dowry offering, It has been stolen from my chambers." "A lie!" Beatrice gasped, struggling against the iron grip of the guards. "I haven't left the kitchens all night. Please, my lord." Rosalind sneered, gesturing to the captain of the guard, a man secretly on the Croft payroll. "Search her quarters, now." The minutes that followed were a torturous blur. Beatrice wept, reaching out for Edward through the bond that tethered their souls, pleading for his protection. Edward stood frozen, torn between the overwhelming, instinctual pull of his fated mate and the crushing weight of his political duties. The hall erupted into frantic whispers. The Alpha mated to a thieving scullery maid. It would be the end of the Iron Fang's reputation. It would mean war with the Crofts. The captain returned, his heavy boots echoing ominously. In his hands, wrapped in Beatrice's tattered woolen shawl, was the glowing moonstone chalice. A collective gasp swept through the nobility. "No!" Beatrice sobbed, shaking her head frantically. "I didn't take it. Someone put it there." "Edward, please, look at me. You know my scent. You know I am innocent." Edward looked at the chalice, then at Rosalind, who stood tall, flanked by her father's armed escorts. Then he looked at Beatrice. He felt the frantic, innocent terror radiating from her through their bond. He knew, deep in his marrow, that she was innocent. But he also saw the sneers of his bannermen. He saw the political ruin of his house. The Iron Fang pack respected strength, order, and noble blood. They would never accept an Omega thief as their Luna. The rebellion would tear his lands apart. Cowardice, masquerading as duty, took hold of him. Edward's face hardened into a mask of stone. He severed the emotional bridge of their bond, slamming mental walls down so violently that Beatrice physically doubled over, screaming in agony. "A fated bond is sacred," Edward announced, his voice booming over the hall, cold and devoid of mercy. "But a thief and a traitor forfeits all rights under pack law. I, Lord Edward Hastings, reject you, Beatrice Waverley. You are no mate of mine." The words were a physical blow. Beatrice collapsed to her knees, blood dripping from her nose as the rejection tore at her soul. "Strip her of the pack's colors," Edward ordered, turning his back on her. "Cast her into the Frost Peak woods. If she is found within our borders by sunrise, she is to be killed on sight." They dragged her screaming into the freezing night. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, sealing her in the dark, howling wilderness. Edward stood at the high table, his hands trembling slightly as he raised a goblet with Rosalind, ignoring the violent, tearing sensation in his chest. He had secured his pack's future, but he had just murdered his own soul. The cold was not merely a temperature, it was a living, breathing predator. It chewed at Beatrice's bare feet and bit through her thin tunic as she stumbled blindly through the towering, snow-laden pines of the Frost Peak Mountains. The rejection had left her in a state of delirious fever. Her inner wolf, previously a quiet, submissive presence, was thrashing in agony, howling a dirge of heartbreak that echoed in the empty caverns of her mind. By the third night, the fever broke, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying clarity. She was going to die. She had found shelter beneath the roots of an ancient, overturned oak, curling into a tight ball as a blizzard raged outside. The frostbite had blackened her toes, and the hunger had carved hollows into her cheeks. "Let go," a whisper echoed in the dark. It is easier to sleep. She closed her eyes, ready to surrender to the white void. But as her heart slowed, a different sound pierced the howling wind. A low, thunderous growl that vibrated through the frozen earth. Beatrice forced her eyes open. Through the swirling snow, glowing amber eyes appeared, not one pair, but dozens. Massive silhouettes detached themselves from the darkness. These were not ordinary wolves. They were gargantuan, their shoulders reaching the height of a grown man, their fur thick and scarred. The largest of them, a grizzled beast with fur the color of iron and ash, stepped into her makeshift den. He shifted seamlessly, standing before her as a towering, heavily muscled man covered in tribal tattoos. This was Leif, the legendary alpha of the True Bloods, a feral, ancient pack that the feudal lords thought were merely bedtime stories to frighten misbehaving pups. Leif knelt, grabbing Beatrice by the chin, his sharp eyes scanning her dying form. He leaned in, taking a deep breath. He didn't smell a weak, banished Omega. He smelled something ancient. "The Waverly Line," Leif murmured, his voice like grinding stones. "They said your blood was bred out, extinct. Yet here you are, reeking of rejection and a coward's scent." He picked her up effortlessly. "You do not get to die today, little royal. The forest claims what the castle discards." The next year was a crucible of blood, ice, and pain. The True Blood pack did not coddle the weak. If Beatrice wanted to eat, she had to hunt. If she wanted to sleep by the fire, she had to fight for her place. Stripped of the oppressive hierarchy of Hastings Manor, Beatrice's inner wolf, untethered from the artificial rank of Omega, began to change. The Waverly bloodline, as Leif revealed, was not a lineage of servants. Centuries ago, they were the first kings of Ethelgard, overthrown by the ancestors of the current lords and forced into servitude to hide their true nature. The trauma of Edward's rejection and the brutal environment of the Frost Peaks broke the seals on her dormant genetics. Her first shift under the blood moon was an explosion of primal power. She did not turn into a standard brown-furred subordinate. She erupted into a beast of blinding snow-white fury. She was a true alpha, towering and lethal. Under Leif's brutal tutelage, the scared, soot-stained maid died, and a warrior was forged. Beatrice learned the art of war. She learned how to rip out a challenger's throat with her teeth, and how to command a room with a single, icy stare. She abandoned the softness of her past, replacing the shattered pieces of her heart with unyielding ambition. When Leif finally fell in battle against a rogue bear, the pack's succession was not guaranteed. A massive, brutal warrior named Kyle challenged Beatrice for the Alpha command. It was a fight to the death on the frozen surface of the Black Lake. Kyle was stronger, but Beatrice was faster, smarter, and fueled by a cold, burning rage that had festered for 3 years. When she finally locked her jaws around his nape and forced him into submission, the ice beneath them cracked, but she stood firm. The pack bowed to her. She was no longer Beatrice the maid. She was crowned the Wolf Queen of the Frost Peaks, a title she wore with a terrifying, beautiful grace. Over the next 2 years, she united the scattered wild packs, amassing an army of lycans unmatched in ferocity and loyalty. She built a hidden fortress of ice and stone in the mountains, yet every winter solstice, a phantom pain would ache in her chest. The severed bond. She knew what she had to do. She had survived the winter. Now it was time to bring the frost to the man who cast her out. 5 years is a long time for a kingdom to rot from the inside out. Lord Edward Hastings stood by the arched window of his study, staring out at the dying forests of the Iron Fang territory. The alliance with the Croft family had been a disastrous failure. Rosalind was vain, cruel, and deeply unpopular with the pack. Her family's wealth had been squandered on lavish tournaments and personal luxuries, while the lower ranks of the pack starved. Worse, the severed mate bond had poisoned Edward. Without his true mate, his wolf was volatile, paranoid, and steadily losing its mind. He had grown gaunt, shadows carved deeply under his golden eyes, and his temper was a lit powder keg. "My lord," Beta Gideon's voice broke the heavy silence. Gideon was a loyal friend, but even he looked exhausted, his armor dull and dented from constant border skirmishes. Edward didn't turn around. "What is it, Gideon? More rogues crossing the southern river?" "No, my lord, it's the north." Gideon hesitated, clutching a heavy parchment sealed with black wax. "The rumors, they are true. The wild packs of the Frost Peaks have united. They have slaughtered the northern rogue factions and absorbed their territories. They are no longer a myth. They are a sovereign army." Edward finally turned, a flicker of genuine alarm piercing his apathy. The Frost Peak wolves were legends, monsters of untamed savagery. If they moved south, the weakened Iron Fang pack would be slaughtered in days. "Who leads them?" Edward demanded, marching to his desk. "They call her the Wolf Queen," Gideon replied, placing the scroll on the oak wood. "She sent an emissary, a massive beast, scarred from head to toe. He bypassed all our patrols and walked right up to the manor gates. He delivered this and left." Edward cracked the black seal. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and commanded absolute authority. "Lord Edward Hastings, your borders are weak, and your lands bleed. I am willing to offer a treaty of non-aggression and trade to spare your people the slaughter they frankly deserve. Meet me at the ruined keep in the Neutral Valley 3 days from now. Come with your Beta and your Luna. Refuse, and I will march my army through your great hall." The Queen of the Frost Peaks. "Arrogant," Edward hissed, slamming his fist onto the desk. "But powerful," Gideon countered softly. "Edward, we cannot fight them. The winter is approaching. Our stores are empty, and the men are losing faith. If this queen is offering a treaty, we must kneel and take it." Edward hated the truth in his friend's words. "Prepare the royal carriage. Tell Rosalind to dress for diplomacy, not a masquerade. We ride for the ruined keep tomorrow." The journey to the ruined keep was fraught with tension. The neutral ground was a valley nestled between the Iron Fang lands and the jagged beginnings of the Frost Peak Mountains. The remnants of an ancient stone castle served as the meeting point. When Edward's carriage arrived, surrounded by 50 of his finest guards, the air immediately grew heavy. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, unnatural fog rolled through the ruined stone pillars. "They are already here," Gideon whispered, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Edward stepped out of the carriage, helping a highly irritable Rosalind down. She was draped in heavy crimson furs, shivering and complaining about the dampness. Edward ignored her, his eyes scanning the mist. Suddenly, the fog parted. Edward's guards instinctively took a step back, their wolves whimpering in submission. Emerging from the mist was a vanguard of true-blood wolves in their shifted forms. They were colossal, their eyes burning like embers. They formed a silent, intimidating corridor leading to the center of the ruins. Through that corridor rode a procession of horseback riders in dark, heavy armor. At the center of the formation was a massive steed, black as a starless night. Seated upon it was the queen. She wore armor of blackened steel over deep sapphire blue velvet. A cloak of heavy white fur spilled over her shoulders. Her face was concealed behind a beautifully crafted, half-face silver mask, molded in the shape of a snarling wolf, leaving only her lips and jaw visible. As she dismounted, her boots hitting the frozen earth with a heavy thud, Edward felt a violent, electrifying jolt in his chest. His breath caught. His inner wolf, lethargic and depressed for 5 years, suddenly slammed against his ribs, howling in frantic, desperate recognition. No, it's impossible, Edward thought, his hands beginning to shake. She is dead. I sent her to her death. The queen walked toward them, her movements deliberate, predatory, and dripping with regal authority. Her guard fanned out, vastly outnumbering and outclassing Edward's men. She stopped 10 paces from Edward, folding her hands behind her back. "Lord Hastings," her voice rang out. It was smooth, rich, and laced with a deadly calm that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. Rosalind, oblivious to the terrifying aura of the woman before her, sneered. "Is it customary for barbarians to hide their faces during diplomatic summits? Or are you simply too hideous to look upon?" The air cracked with tension. A few of the massive true-blood wolves growled, stepping forward, but the queen merely raised a single, armored finger, stopping them instantly. A slow, chilling smile spread across the queen's visible lips. "I assure you, Lady Croft," the queen said softly, her voice carrying flawlessly in the silent valley, "my face is one you know quite well." Slowly, the queen reached up. She unclasped the silver mask and let it fall to the frozen ground. Edward stopped breathing. The world tilted on its axis. Standing before him, radiating an aura of overwhelming power and ancient majesty, was Beatrice. Her ash-colored hair was now a vibrant, cascading silver, braided with leather and steel. Her jaw was sharp, her posture flawless, but her eyes, those cold, unyielding eyes, locked directly onto Edward's horrified face. There was no love left in them, only the promise of absolute ruin. "Hello, Edward," Beatrice whispered, the ghost of her past echoing in the ruined courtyard. "I hear you've ruined my kingdom. I have come to take it back." The silence that descended upon the ruined keep was absolute, heavier than the freezing fog that clung to the ancient stones. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a cataclysm. Edward Hastings could not breathe. His lungs felt as though they had been filled with shattered glass. He stared at the face of the woman he had condemned to a freezing, agonizing death half a decade ago. Beatrice. Her name echoed in the hollow caverns of his mind. A ghost suddenly made flesh and steel. She was no longer the trembling, soot-stained scullery maid who had looked at him with desperate, innocent hope. The woman standing before him was a titan. Her silver hair caught the muted daylight, and her posture was a masterclass in lethal grace. Deep within Edward's soul, his dormant wolf clawed frantically at the mental barriers he had erected 5 years ago. It howled, a sound of unbearable agony mixed with desperate, groveling submission. It recognized its mate, its queen, but the bridge between them was gone, shattered by his own command. "Beatrice!" Edward choked out, the word tearing at his throat. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands reaching out instinctively. "Halt!" The command did not come from Beatrice, but from the massive, heavily scarred warrior standing to her right. Lysander, the new beta of the Frostpeak True Bloods, stepped forward. He did not draw a weapon. He didn't need to. The sheer, suffocating pressure of his aura forced Edward to freeze in his tracks. "You do not address the queen by her given name, broken wolf!" Lysander snarled, his golden eyes flashing with barely contained violence. "You will address her as your grace, or you will not speak at all." "This is a trick!" Rosalind's shrill voice shattered the tension. She scrambled backward, her aristocratic features contorted in ugly, panicked rage. She pointed a trembling, gem-encrusted finger at Beatrice. "It is an illusion, a witch's glamour. That wretched thief died in the snow where she belonged. Kill her. Edward, order your men to kill her this instant." Edward didn't move. He couldn't even look at his wife. His eyes were entirely consumed by the chilling, apathetic gaze of his true mate. Beatrice tilted her head, her expression one of mild amusement, as she finally looked at Rosalind. "Lady Croft, I see 5 years of wearing stolen crowns has done nothing to improve your manners, nor your intellect." "How dare you!" Rosalind shrieked, turning to the captain of the Iron Fang Guard. "Draw your swords! Slay these northern barbarians!" A dozen Iron Fang Guards reluctantly laid hands on the pommels of their swords, their loyalty to their alpha battling against the overwhelming, terrifying scent of the true blood wolves surrounding them. Beatrice sighed, a soft, disappointed sound that carried clearly through the misty ruins. She took one step forward. She didn't shout. She didn't draw a blade. She simply released the iron grip she kept on her inner wolf. An invisible shockwave of pure, ancient alpha power exploded from her. It was not the oppressive, aggressive dominance of standard nobility. It was the crushing weight of the first kings of Ethelgard. The air temperature plummeted further, frost rapidly crystallizing over the stone pillars. Every single Iron Fang Guard dropped to their knees as if their strings had been cut. Their swords clattered uselessly against the stone. Beta Gideon hit the dirt, gasping for air, unable to support the weight of the aura. Even Edward, an alpha in his own right, felt his knees buckle. He fought it, sweat beading on his forehead, but the sheer majesty of her power forced him down until one knee hit the freezing mud. Only Rosalind remained standing, utterly bewildered as to why her husband and her army were suddenly kneeling. Because she possessed no wolf, she felt no pressure, only the sudden, terrifying isolation of being the only one left standing in a courtyard of monsters. "My terms are simple, Lord Hastings," Beatrice said, her voice washing over them like an icy river. She walked slowly toward the kneeling Edward, stopping just inches from him. "Your pack is starving. Your borders are bleeding. Your leadership has driven the proud Iron Fang territory into ruin. I am not here to negotiate a treaty. I am here to accept your unconditional surrender." Edward looked up into her cold sapphire eyes. The pain in his chest was excruciating. "Beatrice, please, I thought you were dead. I have lived with the ghost of my sin every single day." "Your sins are of no interest to me," Beatrice replied, her tone devoid of any emotion. "Here are my terms. You will abdicate your title as Alpha of the Iron Fang. Your territory will be absorbed into the sovereign domain of the Frostpeak True Bloods. The alliance with House Croft is permanently severed, and all Croft forces are to vacate my lands by sunrise tomorrow." "You cannot do this!" Rosalind screamed, stepping forward. "My father is Lord Reginald Croft. He has an army of thousands. He will burn your snowy mountains to the ground." Lysander moved so fast he was a blur, his massive hand wrapping around Rosalind's throat, lifting her effortlessly off the ground. She kicked and gagged, her face turning a mottled purple. "Put her down, Lysander," Beatrice ordered softly. The giant warrior sneered, dropping Rosalind into the mud like a discarded rag doll. She gasped violently, crawling backward in absolute terror. "I am aware of your father's wealth, Lady Croft," Beatrice said, not sparing the woman a glance. She kept her eyes locked on Edward. "Do we have an accord, Edward? Or shall I have Lysander tear your throat out right now and take the territory by force? The choice is yours. Protect your pride and watch your people die, or surrender your crown and let them live." Edward looked around at his men. They were beaten, starved, and terrified. He looked at Gideon, who offered a slow, defeated nod. Finally, Edward looked back at the woman he should have loved. He had sacrificed her to save his pack 5 years ago. Now he would sacrifice his pride and his life to do the same. "I surrender," Edward whispered, bowing his head completely. "The Iron Fang pack is yours, my queen." A triumphant howl erupted from the True Blood vanguard, shaking the very foundations of the ruined keep. Beatrice did not smile. She simply turned her back on him. "We march for Hastings Manor immediately," Beatrice commanded her forces. "Lysander, strip them of their weapons. They walk behind my carriage." The return to Hastings Manor was a macabre procession. 5 years ago, Beatrice had been dragged out of these iron gates, crying and bleeding in the snow. Today, she rode through them at the head of a monstrous army, the undisputed conqueror. The peasants and low-ranking pack members who lined the cobblestone courtyards watched in stunned silence. They recognized the colors of their alpha, but Edward was walking behind the royal carriage, disarmed and stripped of his fur-lined cloak, flanked by giant northern wolves. The sight of Rosalind Croft, covered in mud and weeping hysterically, only added to the surreal spectacle. Beatrice stepped down from her carriage, her heavy white fur cloak dragging slightly on the stone. She paused at the massive oak doors of the great hall. She reached out, her gloved fingertips tracing the iron rivets. The memories threatened to surface. The smell of roasted meat, the music, the devastating moment of the severed bond. But she crushed them with practiced, ruthless efficiency. She pushed the doors open. The great hall was exactly as she remembered it, though perhaps a little dimmer, the tapestries a little more faded under Rosalind's poor management. Beatrice walked purposefully down the center aisle, her boots echoing loudly. She bypassed the lower tables, ignored the whispers of the frightened nobility, and ascended the dais. She did not sit in the Luna's chair. She walked directly to the massive carved mahogany throne of the Alpha and sat down. She owned it all. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves the castle without my explicit permission," Beatrice ordered Lysander, "and prepare the dungeons for a guest." For the next few hours, the manor was thrown into chaotic, terrified submission. Beatrice commandeered the Alpha's private study as her command center. It was late in the evening when a soft, hesitant knock came at the door. "Enter," Beatrice said, not looking up from the ledger of Ironfang grain stores she was inspecting. They were in worse shape than she had calculated. The door opened, and Edward stepped in. He looked terrible. The confident, golden-eyed Alpha she once knew was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted shell of a man. The sheer proximity to her was clearly agonizing for his wolf, pulling at the severed threads of their mate bond. "Your Grace," Edward said, his voice ragged. "I did not summon you, Lord Hastings," Beatrice said, coldly, finally looking up. "I know, but I beg you for 5 minutes of your time, just 5 minutes." Edward took a step closer, falling to his knees before her desk. He didn't care about his dignity anymore. He had none left to preserve. "I need you to know. I need you to understand why I did it." Beatrice leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "I know why you did it, Edward. You were a coward. You traded your soul for a dowry of Croft gold and a military alliance you believed would secure your borders." "It was to save my people," Edward pleaded, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "We were starving. The Western rogues were slaughtering our patrols. If I had chosen you, an Omega maid, over the Croft alliance, my bannermen would have rebelled. It would have meant a civil war. I made the choice of a ruler. I sacrificed my own happiness, my own mate, for the survival of the pack." "Do not dress your weakness up as nobility," Beatrice snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden dangerous gold. "A true ruler does not sacrifice the innocent to appease the corrupt. A true Alpha would have challenged his bannermen, stood by his mate, and forged a stronger pack through loyalty, not political prostitution." Edward flinched as if struck. "You threw me to the wolves, Edward," Beatrice whispered, the ice returning to her voice. "And you did not even have the courage to look me in the eye when the doors slammed shut. You broke my mind. You broke my soul. The woman you were destined for died in a snowbank in the Frost Peaks. I am what climbed out of her grave." "I was wrong," Edward sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I know I was wrong. I have paid for it every day. My wolf is dying, Beatrice. It wastes away without you." "Then let it die," she said, devoid of pity. Before Edward could respond, the heavy oak doors swung open again. Lysander entered, dragging a sniveling, bruised man by the scruff of his neck. The man was dressed in fine, though dirtied, silk robes. "As you requested, my queen," Lysander grunted, throwing the man onto the rug beside Edward. "We intercepted him trying to sneak out through the servant tunnels with a satchel of gold and correspondence." Edward looked at the man, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Griffith? Lord Reginald Croft's spymaster? What is he doing here?" Beatrice stood up, walking slowly around the desk. "He is here, Edward, because you are not just a coward. You are also a fool." She nudged the trembling Griffith with the toe of her boot. "Tell him, Worm, Tell the former Alpha what you told my interrogators. Griffith whimpered, blood leaking from a split lip. Mercy, your grace. Please, speak, or I will have Lysander remove your tongue, Beatrice commanded softly. Griffith squeezed his eyes shut. It was a setup. The Moonstone Chalice. 5 years ago, Edward's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Lady Rosalind. She knew of the mate bond, Griffith stammered. Her father, Lord Reginald, had spies in your court. They knew you were drawn to the maid. They knew if you met her eyes, the bond would snap into place. But the Crofts needed the Iron Fang territory. They needed your military. So, they devised a plan. Edward grabbed Griffith by the lapels of his silk robes, pulling him off the floor. You framed her? You planted the chalice in her quarters? Yes, Griffith shrieked. But it wasn't just us, Lord Hastings. We couldn't have bypassed your guards to get into her quarters. We had inside help. Edward froze. Who? Beatrice looked down at him, her eyes dark with a terrible, vengeful satisfaction. Tell him. Your uncle, Griffith cried out. Lord Alden Hastings. He helped us. Edward dropped the spymaster, stumbling backward as if he had been physically stabbed. Alden? No, Alden raised me. He was my most trusted advisor. He negotiated the Croft alliance. Exactly, Beatrice sneered. Your beloved uncle orchestrated the starvation of your pack. He manipulated the grain taxes and ordered the border patrols to stand down so the rogues could attack. He engineered a crisis so severe that you would have no choice but to accept the Croft marriage. Alden wanted you weak, reliant on Croft money, so he could siphon the treasury and rule through you. You sacrificed your mate for a crisis created by your own family. The realization hit Edward with the force of a collapsing mountain. The civil war he had feared, the starvation he had tried to prevent. It was all a manufactured lie. He had destroyed the love of his life, broken his own soul, and handed his kingdom over to a parasite, all because he was too blind to see the vipers in his own nest. A guttural, horrifying scream ripped from Edward's throat. It was not a human sound. It was the roar of a deeply wounded beast. He turned, his claws extending, his eyes glowing, a violent, unstable red. I will kill him, Edward roared, rushing for the door. I will tear Alden to pieces. Lysander stepped in front of him, backhanding Edward with enough force to send the former Alpha crashing through a heavy wooden bookshelf. You will do nothing, Beatrice said calmly, stepping over the debris to look down at the bleeding Edward. You lost the right to enact justice in this castle the moment you surrendered it. Alden Hastings is my prey, but we must be patient. A rat is most dangerous when it is cornered. She turned back to Griffith. Where is Lord Reginald Croft now? He is marching here, Griffith whispered, terrified. Lady Rosalind managed to send a raven before we were captured. Lord Reginald and your uncle Alden. They have a mercenary army of 3,000 silver swords camped 3 miles east in the Whispering Woods. They are going to attack the manor tonight to take back the territory. Beatrice's smile was terrifying. It was a predator baring its fangs. Good, the Wolf Queen whispered. Let them come. The attack came in the dead of night, just as the blizzard reached its howling apex. Lord Reginald Croft and Alden Hastings had moved with desperate speed. They knew that if the Wolf Queen solidified her hold on the Iron Fang territory, Their decades of plotting and wealth extraction would be ruined. They had pooled their vast resources to hire the Silver Company, a brutal faction of rogue wolves and human mercenaries armed with silver-laced weaponry, specialized in putting down Lycan rebellions. They expected a disorganized, chaotic defense from a manor that had just experienced a change in leadership. They expected Beatrice to be overwhelmed by a sudden siege. They severely underestimated the Frostpeak True Bloods. Beatrice stood on the high battlements of Hastings Manor, the freezing wind whipping her silver hair like a ragged banner. Below her, the courtyard was a sea of darkness, but beyond the iron gates, the glow of thousands of torches illuminated the snow. The mercenary army was chanting, battering rams rolling forward to breach the main gates. Beside Beatrice stood Edward. He was battered, his face bruised from Lysander's strike, but his golden eyes were terrifyingly focused. He had begged Beatrice to let him fight, not as an alpha, not as a commander, but as a foot soldier. He wanted to die defending her, hoping his blood might wash away a fraction of his guilt. Beatrice had silently handed him a broadsword. "They brought silver, Your Grace," Lysander noted, standing on her left, sniffing the air. The toxic, metallic scent of the refined ore burned their sensitive noses, even from a distance. "Let them taste it, then," Beatrice said, coldly. The heavy iron gates buckled under the first strike of the battering ram. The wood splintered. With a deafening crash, the gates gave way, and the Croft mercenaries flooded into the outer courtyard, roaring for blood. "Archers!" Beatrice commanded calmly. From the shadows of the battlements, hundreds of true blood wolves stepped forward, drawing massive recurve bows. They did not fire standard arrows. They fired heavy bolts tipped with pitch, lit a blaze. A rain of fire descended upon the courtyard. The mercenaries screamed as the flaming arrows pierced their armor, turning the snow into a chaotic inferno. But they pressed on, their sheer numbers forcing them forward toward the inner keep. "Now," Beatrice whispered. The heavy portcullis of the inner keep ground upward. From the darkness, the true nightmare of the Frost Peaks was unleashed. The True Blood vanguard, fully shifted into their monstrous, gargantuan forms, charged into the courtyard. The clash was earth-shattering. The air was instantly filled with the wet crunch of bone, the tearing of metal, and agonizing screams. The Frostpeak wolves were nearly twice the size of standard Lycans, their fur thick enough to deflect glancing blows, their jaws strong enough to snap a mercenary in half. Beatrice watched the slaughter with detached calculation. She was waiting for the leaders. Suddenly, a horn blew from the rear of the mercenary lines. A wedge of elite fighters pushed through the chaos, forming a protective ring around two figures on horseback. Lord Reginald Croft, clad in gilded armor, and beside him, Alden Hastings, wielding a deadly, silver-edged halberd. Beatrice's eyes locked onto Alden, the man who had engineered her destruction. She stepped up onto the stone ledge of the battlement. "My queen, wait!" Lysander yelled. But Beatrice had already leaped. She plummeted 50 feet toward the courtyard below. Mid-air, she did not merely shift, she erupted. The transformation was instantaneous, an explosion of primal magic and bone-crushing power. She landed in the center of the mercenary vanguard with the force of a meteor. Where she struck, the stone courtyard shattered, sending men flying in all directions. Standing in the crater was not a standard wolf. It was the true alpha of the ancient Waverley line. She was a colossal beast of pure, blinding snow-white fur. Her eyes glowed with the ethereal blue fire of the frost peaks, and her jaws dripped with lethal intent. Total silence fell over the immediate vicinity. Even the bloodthirsty mercenaries froze, staring up at a creature out of ancient mythology. Lord Reginald Croft's horse panicked, rearing up and throwing him into the bloody snow. Alden Hastings' face drained of color as the monstrous white wolf locked its icy eyes on him. Beatrice roared, a sound that did not just echo in the ears, but vibrated in the marrow of every living thing in the courtyard. She lunged. Mercenaries tried to intercept her with silver spears, but she was a blur of devastating speed. She batted heavily armored men aside with casual swipes of her massive paws, their rib cages collapsing under the impact. She was a force of absolute nature, carving a bloody path directly toward Alden. Alden, driven by absolute terror, spurred his horse forward, swinging his silver halberd in a desperate arc. Beatrice ducked the blade, her jaws snapping shut on the horse's neck, bringing the beast and its rider crashing to the ground. She released the horse, turning her terrifying focus on Alden as he scrambled backward in the slush. But before Beatrice could finish him, a hidden squad of mercenary elites rushed her flank from the shadows of a burning wagon, hauling a massive, heavy iron net laced with pure silver hooks. They threw it over her. Beatrice howled in agony as the silver burned into her pristine white fur, the magic-suppressing metal searing her flesh and forcing her to her knees. Smoke rose from her coat as she thrashed, the hooks digging deeper. Alden saw his opportunity. He scrambled to his feet, picking up his fallen silver halberd, his face twisted into a mask of triumphant malice. "Die, you feral bitch," Alden screamed, raising the weapon high above his head, aiming directly for her exposed neck. Beatrice strained against the burning net, unable to dodge in time. She braced for the killing blow. Clang! Sparks showered over Beatrice's snout. Standing over her, his broadsword trembling under the immense weight of Alden's halberd, was Edward. He had fought his way through the chaos, covered in the blood of his enemies, to reach her. "You will not touch her, uncle," Edward snarled, his golden eyes burning with absolute, suicidal fury. Alden laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You always were a weak boy, Edward. Too easily manipulated, too easily broken." Alden twisted the halberd, hooking Edward's broadsword and violently wrenching it out of his grasp. The sword clattered uselessly away. With a swift, brutal motion, Alden reversed his grip and drove the heavy, silver-bladed butt of the halberd directly into Edward's chest. The silver blade pierced Edward's armor, plunging deep into his torso, missing his heart by an inch, but piercing his lung. Edward gasped, blood erupting from his lips. He fell to his knees, clutching the shaft of the weapon. "No!" The scream that tore from Beatrice's mind was not a word, but a visceral wave of psychic agony. Seeing her fated mate pierced by silver, despite the severed bond, triggered an ancient, protective instinct that defied logic or magic. The rage of the wolf queen eclipsed the pain of the silver net. Beatrice forced herself to her feet, the silver hooks tearing her flesh, burning her down to the muscle. She ignored the agony. With a colossal heave, she ripped the heavy iron net apart, shattering the chains through sheer, impossible brute strength. Alden barely had time to register his impending death. He turned, his eyes wide with horror. Beatrice's jaws clamped around Alden's torso. She didn't bite to kill immediately. She bit to crush. Alden's screams were cut short as she violently shook him, the sickening crunch of his spine snapping, echoing over the din of battle. She threw his broken body against the stone walls of the keep, where he slumped, lifeless. The remaining mercenaries, witnessing the brutal execution of their employer and the unstoppable power of the White Wolf, broke formation. They dropped their weapons and fled into the dark woods, pursued mercilessly by the True Blood vanguard. Lord Reginald Croft was apprehended by Lysander, dragged away by his hair, weeping for mercy. The battle was won, but Beatrice did not howl in victory. She shifted back to her human form, falling to her hands and knees in the crimson-stained snow. She was naked, shivering, her flesh covered in horrific, smoking burns from the silver net. Lysander rushed to her side, immediately throwing his heavy fur cloak over her shoulders. Beatrice ignored her wounds. She crawled through the slush and blood toward Edward. He was lying on his back, the silver weapon still lodged in his chest. His breathing was wet and shallow, his golden eyes dulling as life slowly leaked out of him. The silver poison was spreading rapidly through his veins, turning his skin pale and dark veins visible across his neck. Beatrice reached him, her trembling, blood-stained hands hovering over the horrific wound. Edward coughed, a weak smile touching his lips as he looked up at her face. I couldn't protect you then," Edward whispered, his voice bubbling with blood. "But I protected you now. It's enough." Beatrice stared down at him. 5 years of hatred, 5 years of ice and vengeance, warred with the primal, undeniable pull of her soul. She had come to destroy him. She had come to watch him suffer. But as the Wolf Queen looked into the dying eyes of the man who had broken her heart, the ice finally began to crack. The silver was creeping up Edward's neck in dark, jagged veins, a physical manifestation of the death claiming him. Beatrice fell to her knees in the blood-soaked snow, her silver-burned hands hovering over the horrific wound. The cold, calculating queen of the Frost Peaks vanished, replaced by a devastating, instinctual panic. "Lysander!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Get healer Edric! Now!" Edric of the Aylesbury Order, the most renowned apothecary in the Northern Territories, rushed to her side, his leather satchel clattering against his hip. He took one look at the blackened wound and shook his head, his face instantly draining of color. "Your Grace." The blade pierced his lung and grazed the cardiac sac. "The silver toxicity is absolute. He has mere minutes." "Save him!" Beatrice commanded, her eyes flashing with dangerous alpha gold. "No herbs can purge this magnitude of poison," Edric whispered, bowing his head in sorrow. "Only a miracle could reverse it." Edward coughed, a wet, horrifying sound, and weakly grabbed Beatrice's trembling hand. His skin was already ice cold, his golden eyes losing their brilliant luster. "Beatrice, let it be," he rasped, struggling for every breath. "I owe a debt of blood. This is justice." "I decide what justice is!" Beatrice roared, tears finally cutting tracks through the soot and blood on her cheeks. "You do not get to die, Edward Hastings. You do not get to take the coward's way out again and leave me with this silence." She stared down at the man who had broken her. The betrayal still ached, a deep scar that would never truly fade. But the sight of him sacrificing his life to save hers shattered the final remnants of her icy armor. The historical chronicles penned by scribe Bartholomew of Oakhaven would later describe this night as the true reunification of the northern and southern realms. But to Beatrice, it was simply a desperate plea to the moon goddess. There was only one way. The ancient texts Leif had taught her in the frozen wilderness spoke of the Waverly bloodline's purest, most dangerous gift. A true alpha of the first kings did not merely rule, they possessed the power of anima transference, the ability to purge death itself from a fated mate. But it required the bond to be entirely reforged in blood and absolute submission. "You belong to me now," Beatrice whispered fiercely, gripping his jaw and forcing him to look at her. "Not as an alpha, not as a lord, but as mine. Do you yield, Edward? Do you give me your life?" "Forever," Edward gasped, his eyes rolling back as the silver reached his heart. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She leaned down, her fangs fully extending, and sank them deeply into the juncture of his neck and shoulder. It was not a gentle claiming. It was a violent, desperate reclamation of a severed soul. Beatrice's alpha aura exploded outward, a blinding shockwave of pure white energy that pushed Lysander and Edric back. She forced her ancient, untainted magic into Edward's dying veins. The silver toxicity, visible as black webbing beneath his skin, violently hissed as it was neutralized by the overwhelming purity of the true blood magic. Edward's back arched off the snowy ground, a ragged gasp tearing from his lungs as the gaping hole in his chest began to rapidly knit together. When Beatrice finally pulled away, a glowing silver scar sealing over Edward's bite mark, he collapsed into the snow, unconscious, but his breathing was steady. The dark veins had vanished. The bond, once a shattered bridge, was rebuilt, not as equals, but with Beatrice standing firmly as the undisputed sovereign of his soul. 6 months later, the great hall of Hastings Manor had been transformed. The oppressive dark stone and fading tapestries were replaced with shimmering frost-peak crystal and banners of deep sapphire. Beatrice sat upon the newly forged winter throne, the absolute ruler of the largest united territory the continent had seen in 4 centuries. Justice had been poetic. Lord Reginald Croft and his daughter Rosalind were stripped of their aristocratic titles, their wealth seized to feed the starving southern packs. They were banished to the Frost Peak wilderness, forced to survive the very same brutal winter they had once condemned Beatrice to endure. To her right stood Lysander, her loyal beta and commander of the unified armies. But to her left, kneeling beside the dais with his head bowed in quiet reverence, was Edward. He wore no crown, no armor of leadership, only the heavy blue cloak of the Queen's consort. He had lost his kingdom, his pride, and his title. But as he looked up at the fierce, beautiful woman on the throne, his golden eyes held absolute peace. He had finally found his true purpose. Beatrice Waverly, the scullery maid thrown to the wolves, had returned to lead the pack. And in the heart of winter, she had finally forged her empire. What a breathtaking journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate vengeance. Beatrice's transformation from a broken, banished maid to the unstoppable wolf queen is proof that sometimes the fire inside you burns hotter than the coldest winter around you. If you loved this epic tale of redemption, the intense twists, and Edward's desperate sacrifice to earn back his fated mate, please smash that like button. Share this story with your friends who can't resist a gripping werewolf romance. And make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, immersive dramas delivered right to your feed. See you in the next tale.